Hello. Welcome again to our discussion on issues in biomedical ethics. Right now we're sitting here in the Muse in Lynchburg, where you can come get a good cup of coffee sometimes if you want to. Today I want to talk a little bit about the issue of deception in the healthcare environment. Should doctors and other healthcare workers ever actually deceive their patients in some way or another? You can kind of think of a scenario maybe where a doctor maybe doesn't want to give the patient all the information because he feels that it might in some way or another be harmful to the patient. Or maybe he wants to mislead the patient in order the patient to live a more healthy lifestyle. Those kinds of situations are what we're talking about here. Is that ever justifiable? Well, it's a good question. Actually, it's kind of interesting. When you look at the history of medical ethics, we have a lot of ethical principles that have a long tradition in that history. For example, confidentiality has been there pretty much ever since the beginning. But it's interesting that deception or lying really hasn't been an issue in medical ethics until fairly recently. It's only been in the 20th century where different medical codes of ethics have brought up the issue that doctors or medical workers have a specific obligation to be honest with their patients. There's a reason for that, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I get into my discussion here on deception. Now, of course, we're using the word deception here, but we need to talk about what exactly is that. And then there's three actual different forms of conception that I want to comment on here, three different types of deception. The first of these, of course, is simply what we call lying. Now, what exactly does it mean to lie? Well, lying is verbalizing to a person or a group of persons what one believes to be a falsehood with the intention of deceiving that person or group of persons. Now, my definition here, and I read that definition because it's very specific and I want to make some comments about it, brings out some very important points about lying. First of all, lying is verbal. It's something we do with words. We either write it or we say it to another person. That's what it means to lie, okay? There's other forms of deception that are non-verbal forms of deception, but lying is specifically a verbal form of deception. The second thing about lying is that when you lie, you're verbalizing to a person what you believe to be something that is false with the intention of deceiving them, okay? Now, that's very important, because we want to separate a lie from maybe just a mistake. For example, if I was to tell you something like the local McDonald's is serving free hamburgers today for lunch and anybody goes there can get a free hamburger, and if I really believe that that's true, but in fact it's not true, well then I didn't lie to you, I just was mistaken. I thought it was true and I communicated it to you and it turns out that it's really not true. Okay, that's a mistake, that's not a lie. A lie is something that I intentionally want to deceive you about. Also, a lie is something that I believe is false. Whether or not it's really false or not is not the case. For example, again, suppose that I want to trick you into going to McDonald's for lunch and into thinking that you're going to get a free hamburger. So I tell you they're serving free hamburgers at McDonald's for lunch today. Okay, I am intending to deceive you. But let's say that unbeknownst to me, they really are serving free hamburgers at lunch today. Did I lie to you? Yeah, I did. Because even though what I told you was in fact really true, I believed it was false, and I was intending to deceive you. So it's important to understand exactly what a lie is. A lie is an intention to deceive something we believe to be false to a group of persons through some sort of verbal means. That's lying, okay? A second form of deception that I want to talk about is what we call pretense. Pretense is simply the intentional act of leading a person to adopt or to maintain a false belief. Now, pretense is a nonverbal form of deception, and you can do it one of two ways. You can either allow a person to maintain a false belief, or you can actually lead them to believe something to be false, okay? It's where I do particular actions that cause a person to believe something that's false, and I want them to continue their false belief, okay? But I'm not necessarily saying anything about that. See, sometimes we like to think of a loophole, and the loophole is that, well, I didn't really lie here, but that doesn't mean you didn't deceive. Okay, you could deceive through acting in a pretentious manner, by acting in a way that causes somebody to either maintain a false belief or something you believe is a false belief, or to adopt something that's a false belief. And that's another thing as well. Pretension is broader than lying because it takes into account now nonverbal communication and leading people on while not specifically being verbal. Lying is generally considered worse than pretension because lying is very active and very direct, where pretension can be maybe passive and indirect. They're both forms of deception, but we can say that one form of deception is maybe worse than another form of deception, even though both can be bad. And I would say that lying is certainly worse than acting in a pretentious manner here. Okay, and so, but we're not really supposed to do either. There's another form of deception that specifically comes into play in the medical context. okay? And that is intentional non-disclosure, okay? And this is where we withhold information that a patient has at least a prima facie right to know, okay? We withhold that information from them in some form or another. This is mostly done in cases where a poor prognosis is present and the physician simply deems that it's unnecessary for the patient to know this information. And so we just simply don't tell them, patients for doing that, okay? At times, attempt is made to justify non-disclosure by appealing to family wishes, but that's usually not the case, okay? In other words, most physicians will tell you that if a non-disclosure is ever justified, it's for the good of the patient, not necessarily for what families have wanted to do here, okay? This is probably in many ways the easiest form of deception to justify because generally disclosure depends upon certain relationships. For example, a physician might have an obligation to disclose where other members of the healthcare team don't. Therefore, if a patient was to ask the healthcare team about their particular situation and the physician has not told them, the healthcare team member probably should not tell them either. Okay, they should wait and allow the primary physician to decide whether or not to disclose information to the patient or not. Now, this idea of non-disclosure brings up a very interesting tradition or history in medical ethics, and that's called the therapeutic privilege. Throughout the history of medicine, doctors have always felt that the issue of whether or not to inform patients of their condition or to give them the information they need is a privilege that they have as doctors, and therefore they treat information as medicine, okay? Just like in a pharmaceutical medical device, for example, like a pill that you have to take, we don't have to take all the pills at one time, we dose them out as you need them. Well, doctors feel that information is like that as well, that therefore they shouldn't feel obligated to give information out to patients all at one time, that they can dose it out as needed. And if they feel that a patient doesn't need to know certain information, they feel they have the right to withhold that information from that patient. That's called the therapeutic privilege, okay? It's got a long tradition in medicine, but medicine has traditionally been very paternalistic throughout its history, and therefore, because of the paternalism, doctors have felt like they have the right to be able to control this idea of information. In recent years, though, the idea of information has become very controversial at this particular point. We have a conversation going on here next to us here, so they are kind of interrupting us at this point. But at any rate, doctors have felt like the idea of information for a long period of time, it was something they should have control over. But in recent years, patients are saying more and more, no, we should have more control over our care. And so this idea of the therapeutic privilege is beginning to wane. It's beginning to lose its influence very well here. Now, should we be involved in deceiving our patients? Well, there are three major arguments that are usually given to justify patient and deception to patients. The first is what's called benevolent deception. Benevolent deception basically says that deception is justifiable when it fulfills obligations we have to be obligations of benevolence or non-maleficence to my patients. In other words, if I feel that information is going to be harmful and I feel like it would be helpful for them not to know, then I have a right to withhold that information and possibly maybe even lie to them to give them that, okay, in some way or another. I think there's some problems with this idea of benevolent deception. First of all, it's highly consequentialistic, which means it depends upon its consequences to justify it. I justify lying to the patient because I think it produces the best consequences. But the problem is, of course, we don't always know what the best consequences are going to be at that particular point. Do we really know that, in fact, that the patient is not going to be able to, is going to do something drastic with this information? A second problem, I think, with this is it really violates respect for a patient's autonomy and their integrity and their dignity. I think when we lie to people, what we're doing is we're subtly manipulating them. We're making it so that they can't make decisions or rationally make decisions because we've manipulated the information for them. And I think when we do that, in a sense, we're insulting them. We're telling them we don't believe they know best what to do with information there. Therefore, I think it's problematic to argue for benevolent deception. Another argument in favor of that justifies deception is the idea that some physicians say, well, patients really can't know the whole truth, or if they could know it, they wouldn't understand it, or we're not able to communicate in some way or another. I don't think that argument works very well either. I personally think that most patients can understand basic information, and if you give it to them in a basic way, they can get that. Maybe we can't give them everything, maybe they can't understand everything, maybe that's an ideal, but we should stretch to inform them as much as we possibly can about what we're doing here. A third argument that sometimes is given in favor of lying to patients is that some patients simply don't want to know the truth. And sometimes they'll communicate that to us in other ways besides words, sometimes through actions or something like that. They'll tell us they don't want to know the truth. I think that you got to be real careful if you're assuming that a patient doesn't want to know the truth, or if you're reading into their actions that they don't want to know the truth. I think it's important that that you find out from the patient specifically what they want. If a patient tells you they don't want to know the truth, well, they have the right to that, and I think you can honor that right. But I would be sure to get that in writing and be sure that you understand that that's what the patient's asking for, and make sure this patient specifically asks for that. Don't assume that the patient doesn't want to know the truth. I think that's dangerous. There's some other arguments that I want to give against deception in the workplace. First of all, I don't think it's certain that being truthful with a patient will in fact really harm them, okay, as often as given as justification for lying to the patient. Even in cases where there's a strong probability of that happening, it hasn't happened. Most patients can take the truth. They want to hear the truth as much as they can, and I think we need to be as honest with them as we can. A second problem, I think, with lying that argues against lying or deceiving our patients is I think it's erroneously assumed that the deception can be effectively carried out in some way that we can keep it. But folks, almost all the time that we lie to people, the truth eventually comes out. And when that happens, the situation is worse than it was. Now we have not only the problem of the patient knowing the information we didn't want them to know, but we also have the problem of having betrayed the patient's trust. Patients already have a difficult time trusting their physicians and their healthcare workers. They already feel like something's going on behind their back. When they find out they've been lied to or been deceived, the situation is now much, much worse at that particular point. Okay? The patient's in a worse condition. That can happen at that point. Another problem, I think, with the idea of lying is that when we lie, and if it's successful, it simply reinforces the idea of lying again. Oh, well, deception worked this time, so I guess I can use it again the next time. And it starts to lead to a general character of deception. It starts to lead to the idea that we can deceive more often particular patients. And I think we need to be careful about that as well. We need to realize that one lie can lead to another lie, can lead to another lie, and they just simply build. And all of a sudden we developed it as a regular tactic of handling our patients, that we don't tell them the truth or we don't give them information when they need to give information. Does this mean that we should never deceive our patients? Well, it's hard to say never. I don't want to say there isn't a situation maybe where deception might be, in fact, the best thing to do. But I think we need to be very, very careful and handle those situations very, very rarely. I think honesty is the most important aspect involved in our medical treatment with our patients, because in fact, trust is the most important thing we have with them. They have to trust us to give them correct information so they'll take the medicine they need to take and do the stuff we need to ask them to do. We need to have that trust as an important basis for our relationship with each other. Okay? When we lie, when we deceive, we simply erode that trust. And I'm not sure those consequences are worth the idea of lying. So while I won't say that we should never deceive our patients, I will say that it should be extremely rare that we would do so, in the rarest of all possible cases. And it has to be fully justifiable in those cases. Well, that's enough about lying. I hope you have a good day today. Thank you very much.